Picture the factory floor at Kassel in the spring of 1945. Weeks earlier, this building had turned out king tigers, 68 tons of German steel rolling off the line toward the Eastern Front. Now, American soldiers are walking through it, and 80% of what they find is rubble. But here is the part almost nobody tells you. Within months, that same shattered factory is back at work, not building tanks, fixing locomotives. The men who built the most feared armored vehicle of the war are now welding boxcars. How does a factory built to arm an empire end up patching train wheels for the people who just conquered it? And why did some of these plants get torn apart, bolt by bolt, and shipped to Russia, while others were quietly allowed to rebuild? The answer involves a peace conference in a bombed-out palace, a secret argument between four victorious powers who barely trusted each other, and a decision that would quietly shape the next 50 years of German industry. This is the real story of what happened to the factories that built Hitler's tanks. To understand what happened after, you need to understand what these places actually were. Germany's tank industry was never one single giant factory. It was a scattered network, spread across the country by design, because Albert Speer and the Armaments Ministry knew that concentrating everything in one place was an invitation for Allied bombers. Krupp in Essen produced the guns, the turrets, and the steel that everyone else depended on. Henschel in Kassel built the Tiger and the King Tiger, the machines that became propaganda symbols even when their numbers were small. Maschinenfabrik Augsburg-Nürnberg, known as MAN, built Panthers, alongside Maschinenfabrik Niedersachsen-Hannover, Daimler-Benz, and Demag. Between 1943 and 1945, those firms together produced roughly 6,000 Panthers. In Berlin Borsigwalde sat Alkett, short for Altmärkische Kettenwerke, a Rheinmetall-Borsig subsidiary that specialized in assault guns, and later in fixing the flawed suspension of the massive Maus super-heavy tank prototype. And in Austria, in a farming village called St. Valentin, with barely 2,000 residents before the war, stood the Nibelungenwerk, the single most modern tank plant the Reich ever built, responsible for more than half of all Panzer IVs produced during the entire war. These were not abstract industrial statistics. They were small cities of labor, staffed in part by tens of thousands of forced workers and prisoners of war, kept running by a regime that needed steel more than it needed anything else. And by late 1944, that need had become desperate. Allied bombing had cut off manganese from Ukraine and molybdenum from Norway, the raw materials that made armor hard enough to stop a shell. Production kept climbing anyway, right up until the moment it couldn't. By the autumn of 1944, the bombing that had mostly spared the tank plants for years finally found them. Nibelungenwerk was hit hard in October, workshops flattened, yet crews kept building tanks in the surviving halls and in mobile repair sheds set up among the ruins. In the final quarter of that year, the plant still managed to turn out hundreds more Panzer IVs and dozens of the massive Jagdtiger tank destroyers. By March 1945, with the front collapsing, the plant stopped building new vehicles altogether and switched to repairing whatever the retreating army could drag back to it. Then came May. Germany surrendered. Japan would follow months later. Across the country, the machines that had run around the clock for years fell silent almost overnight. Millions of men in uniform began the long walk home, many of them straight back to towns whose only major employer had been building weapons. In Kassel, the once immense Henschel works stood 80% destroyed, but astonishingly still carried 15,000 names on its payroll, workers with nowhere else to go and no product left to build. In Essen, the Krupp works, birthplace of German artillery for over a century, sat under Allied occupation, its owner Alfred Krupp facing arrest. In Berlin, Soviet troops walked into the Alkett plant on the 23rd of April, even before the formal surrender was signed. The war had ended in days, but the question of what to do with the machines that had built it would take years to answer, and the argument over that question would end up mattering almost as much as the war itself. That argument began at Potsdam, in a palace outside a ruined Berlin in the summer of 1945. Stalin, Truman and Churchill, replaced partway through by Clement Attlee, sat down to decide the fate of a country that had just tried to conquer the world twice in 30 years. The Americans arrived pushing something close to the Morgenthau Plan, a proposal from Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr. that envisioned stripping Germany of its heavy industry almost entirely, turning it into a mostly agricultural country incapable of ever rearming. The four powers agreed on the broad strokes. German armed forces would be abolished, munitions factories would be destroyed, any civilian industry that could be repurposed for war would be restricted. The tricky part was defining exactly how much industry Germany actually needed to survive without becoming, in Allied eyes, a threat again. That question produced the first level of industry plan, signed in March 1946, which set German heavy industry at 50% of its 1938 levels. Whatever fell above that ceiling was declared surplus and made available for dismantlement, meaning entire factories, machine by machine, could be unbolted from their foundations and shipped abroad as reparations. The Soviets moved fastest and hardest. The Western Allies moved more cautiously and increasingly more reluctantly, because a new and colder kind of war was already beginning to reshape their priorities. What looked at Potsdam like simple justice was about to collide with the emerging reality of a divided Europe, and the tank factories were caught directly in the middle of it. Here is where the story splits into as many directions as there were factories. In Essen, the Krupp works had built cannons, tanks and submarines under Gustav and later Alfred Krupp, using tens of thousands of forced labourers along the way. British occupation authorities, eager to be seen dismantling German war-making capacity, gave the firm special attention. The modern metallurgical plant at Essen-Borbeck, only in operation since 1929, was handed over to the Soviet Union at the end of 1945 as reparations. It was not partially stripped, it was completely dismantled, taken apart down to its foundations, and shipped east. In Berlin, the Alkett plant tells an even stranger story. Soviet forces occupied it in April 1945 and ordered it dismantled within months. But Alkett sat inside what became the French sector of occupied Berlin, and under the Yalta arrangement, the Soviets could not simply carry off everything they wanted. Whatever machinery survived that partial dismantling was put to work making pots, pans and buckets, a factory that had built assault guns now stamping out kitchenware for a broken city. By early 1948, Alkett had resumed light mechanical engineering. Within a few more years, it was producing gears, gearboxes, and stainless steel screws, and by the late 1950s it had been renamed Alkett Maschinenbau, its tank-building past folded quietly into an ordinary industrial supplier. In Kassel, Henschel's path looked different again. Rather than dismantlement, the Allies licensed the ruined plant to repair locomotives, buses, and trucks, but explicitly forbade it from manufacturing new commercial vehicles for a period afterward, a controlled, supervised return to production rather than a wholesale seizure of machinery. And at Nibelungenwerk in Austria, ownership reverted to its parent company, Steyr-Daimler-Puch, which pivoted the same assembly halls that had built Panzer IVs and Jagdtigers toward tractors and trucks, feeding a rebuilding Austrian economy instead of a war machine. 4 factories. 4 completely different fates, dismantled to nothing, stripped and repurposed, restricted but preserved, quietly converted. And every single one of those outcomes was decided not by engineers, but by occupying governments arguing over how much of Germany's industrial past should be allowed to survive into its future. There are pieces of this story that rarely make it into the history books. When British forces moved into the Ruhr, they didn't just find intact factory buildings. At Krupp facilities and at a site called Meppen, they discovered actual hardware connected to Hitler's most infamous vanity project, the Maus Super Heavy Tank, a machine so massive it could barely cross a bridge. British troops recovered turrets and a gun mount built for the Maus, along with the bulk of its design documentation, which the Americans and French later had to request access to second-hand. Separately, American forces captured Ferdinand Porsche's own design bureau in May 1945, along with Porsche himself, seizing an entire archive of super-heavy tank research in one stroke. Inside Alkett, the story gets darker still. In 1943, a designer named Hugo Kapteiner had organized a resistance cell within the plant, producing leaflets and orchestrating sabotage, reportedly directing welders to use excessive electrical current so that welds meant to hold armor plate together would quietly fail. Kapteiner was discovered and arrested in 1944 and executed on the 20th of April, 1945, just 3 days before Soviet troops walked through the factory gates he had spent 2 years secretly undermining. Meanwhile, out at Nibelungenwerk, a separate late-war program had been racing to unify German tank destroyer production around a single new vehicle, meant to replace half a dozen different assault gun types running through Alkett, Krupp, and Nibelungenwerk simultaneously. The plan called for the switch to begin at Alkett in November 1944, at Krupp in January 1945, and finally at Nibelungenwerk itself in March. It never got the chance. And perhaps strangest of all, the reparations process itself turned out to be far messier than anyone at Potsdam had imagined. By April 1948, American occupation officials estimated 81% of dismantlement work was complete in their zone. But investigators found that in many cases, complete dismantlement meant only that a machine had been unbolted, lifted from its foundation, and coated in preservative oil. Not that it had actually been shipped anywhere. Entire factories sat frozen in a kind of industrial limbo, disassembled but going nowhere. That limbo did not last. By the late 1940s, the emerging Cold War was quietly rewriting everything Potsdam had decided. A Germany stripped down to 50% industrial capacity made sense in 1945, when the enemy was Germany itself. It made far less sense in 1948, when the emerging enemy was the Soviet Union, and a devastated deindustrialized Western Europe looked less like justice and more like a liability. West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer pushed hard against continued dismantling, writing directly to the Allied High Commission in 1949 to plead for a halt, specifically over the fate of the massive Thyssen steel works at Duisburg. The Western Allies, increasingly focused on rebuilding a stable, prosperous, non-communist Germany as a bulwark against Soviet expansion, began quietly abandoning the reparations policy they had signed on to at Potsdam only a few years earlier. And that shift changed everything for companies like MAN, Daimler-Benz, and Henschel. Instead of being stripped for parts, they were folded back into a rebuilding European economy. MAN returned to building trucks and diesel engines. Daimler-Benz rebuilt around civilian automobiles and commercial vehicles. Henschel, once forbidden from manufacturing new vehicles, was eventually permitted to resume full production, this time of buses, trucks, and machinery instead of tanks. The very industrial capacity the Allies had spent years trying to dismantle became, within less than a decade, the engine of what West Germans would come to call their economic miracle. The machines survived, the steel survived, only the purpose changed. There is something almost impossible to believe about how directly that wartime industrial base connects to the world you live in now. Rheinmetall, the parent company that once owned Alkett and built the housing for Hitler's most secret superweapons, is today one of Europe's largest defense contractors, supplying artillery and armored vehicles to NATO allies and, since 2022, to Ukraine. MAN still builds trucks and buses across Europe. Daimler-Benz became part of one of the largest automotive manufacturers on Earth. The Nibelungenwerk site in St. Valentin still produces vehicles, now under different ownership, in the same Austrian town whose population once numbered barely 2,000 people, around a tank factory built to churn out Panzer IVs. Even Krupp, stripped down to its foundations at Essen-Borbeck, survived as a company, and eventually merged into what is now ThyssenKrupp, still one of the largest industrial firms in Germany. The Allied dream of permanently disarming German heavy industry lasted barely 3 years before Cold War necessity overtook it. What replaced that dream wasn't total forgiveness, and it wasn't total punishment either. It was something more pragmatic and more uncomfortable, a recognition that the same steel, the same machine tools, and often the very same buildings that had built an army of tigers and panthers could just as easily build the trucks and engines of a peaceful Allied Europe if someone simply let them. So the next time you see a modern German-built truck, or read that Rheinmetall is shipping artillery to a European ally, remember where that industrial lineage actually begins. Not in a boardroom. In a bombed-out factory floor in Kassel, where 15,000 workers who used to build the most feared tank of the war picked up their tools again to fix train wheels, because that was the only work left, and because somewhere in Berlin and Washington and Moscow, 4 exhausted victorious powers were still arguing over exactly how much of Germany's war machine deserved to survive its defeat. If you want to understand how nations rebuild after they've destroyed everything, you don't start with the peace treaty. You start on the factory floor. If this kind of hidden history interests you, subscribe, because the next untold story is already waiting, buried in a set of post-war salvage records nobody has opened in decades.